Hello again, everybody. This is Rusty, aka William Robinson, aka Dr. Robinson, also known as the Blues Doctor. Thank you for coming to our podcast again this week. I wanted to let everybody know last week's podcast was a little bit delayed, not because of anything we did, but because YouTube, for some reason, had a problem with processing it. It took it 3 or 4 days longer than usual, so it didn't come out until today when we're filming, which was Friday, March 21st. Hopefully, you'll catch up with that. So remember to like and subscribe, ring the bell, share, and make sure to tell YouTube that your doctor recommends that you watch this podcast weekly, or dire consequences might result. In the meantime, we got lots to talk about today, so let's get to it. So I love looking at the calendar, and I've got a few good ones for this week. First off, March 21st, 1991 was the day Leo Fender died. Anybody who has anything to do with guitars or music will know who Leo Fender was. He was the designer, developer, producer of Fender guitars, including the Telecaster, the Stratocaster, and many others. Leo started his business in the late 40s when he took his electrical engineering skills. He was, in fact, an engineer, but not a musician, to design and build a prototype solid body electric guitar. And it went through several iterations or names, but Leo's great innovation was to realize he could use mass production techniques in order to build these guitars so that they became affordable for working musicians. Previously, guitars have been built by hand for generations, centuries, and as such, they were very expensive. And most people who were working class didn't have access to them. Well, suddenly the Fender electric guitar made that instrument available to virtually anybody. So that greatly expanded the playing field and allowed many other people to get into music that might otherwise not have been able to, and in part set off the rock and roll explosion of the 1960s. You can't count the number of musicians that have used Fender guitars over the years. Everybody from Eric Clapton to Jimi Hendrix to Keith Richard, everybody else in between has used them. And the business, despite some ups and downs over the years, is still going strong. Fender Musical Instruments is still the largest music company on the planet. So rest in peace, Leo Fender. Thank you very much. I've got, I don't know how many Fender guitars around here, and I love them all. Also on March 21st in 2004, Ozzy Osbourne of Black Sabbath and several other different bands was named the U.S. Ambassador to Aliens Visiting Earth. I'm not joking. This started out as a Yahoo News poll, which allowed anybody who signed on to vote on who they thought would be the best ambassador to aliens visiting Earth. But it became official when it was signed off on, kind of tongue in cheek, by the George Bush White House in that same year. So if you see a alien, I guess call Ozzy and let him know. And finally, Snoop Dogg. Snoop was sentenced on this date in 2006 to probation and fines based on a weapons charge. Seems Snoop was leaving the airport one day and he was in his rental car and he got pulled over for a traffic violation. And they found that he had a 20-inch collapsible baton that was categorized as a weapon. Snoop did his time, paid his fine, so forth, and perhaps ironically, he became the hero of the 2024 Summer Olympics this year with his commentary. So, it tells you everybody can be redeemed. And I want to continue our series this week on genetic testing for cancer. And this week, our topic is going to be genetic testing specifically for unaffected people to determine their cancer risk. So what that means is people who do not have the disease but are interested in what their cancer risk is in the future for whatever reason, get a tissue test, blood, saliva, whatever, for that test. So this actually has been going on for some time. Typically, your doctor would talk to you about genetic testing under certain circumstances and for certain groups of people. This would include people who had a strong family history of cancer, people who had a relative who had a positive test themselves for cancer, people who actually had a personal history of cancer themselves and might be at risk for another one, people with very rare cancers that might be at risk for another one, and many others. There were other categories as well. Ethnicities were one. Probably the most famous is the Ashkenazi Jewish group, which was at risk for the BRCA or breast and ovarian cancer associated gene, and others. The test itself is then ordered by a doctor who takes a sample, like I said before, blood or saliva or sometimes other tissue, and sends it to an external lab. That laboratory does the test and sends the results back to you and your doctor. The results basically can be in three categories. First is positive for a certain mutation. The second, obviously, would be negative for a specific mutation. And the third would be VUS, or variation of unknown significance. And we're going to talk about those in more detail. But basically, that's what you get about this whole panel of genes. In other words, it's a multi-gene panel of tests that are being done from your tissue. Once the results of the test are back, you will want to sit down and have your doctor interpret them for you and have a discussion of what they mean. You may often have a genetic counselor involved in this process who helps with the interpretation. From there, you'll make some kind of a plan, be it more testing or maybe some specific medical intervention. The genetic counselor, in fact, may help you with the psychologic implications of the test. So, for example, if you have a genetic mutation that puts you at risk for cancer and you know it's hereditary, then you may be upset that you're potentially passing something on to your children. That happens a lot. Another risk may be so-called survivor's guilt. This is where when your family has a genetic mutation like BRCA, that would be a good one, like we've talked about before, that affects multiple individuals, you take the test and you're found not to have it. In other words, you have a negative test for BRCA. Some people feel guilty almost about not having it when their other family members do. So the genetic counselors can help with discussing many things like that. So there are pluses and minuses to this kind of a test. The pluses, obviously, are that you get the information that may let you know whether you are or not at risk for that cancer. If you're not, then obviously that's something of a relief. If you are, then you know what plans potentially you need to make. Another plus of that test is that if you are actually affected by a cancer already, that test can allow you and your doctor to discuss treatment. And we kind of touched on this last time with the example of BRCA associated cancers or HRD associated cancers being appropriate for treatment with the PARP inhibitors. In other words, we know that BRCA positive tumors or HRD positive tumors will do better. In other words, they'll have a better outcome if they're treated with a category of drugs called the PARP inhibitors. The minuses of the test are significant also. These include the things we've already talked about, like child guilt, sibling guilt, survivor guilt, all of those things. But more practically, how about the need for additional medical interventions? Like, say, you need a surgery to have something done. Again, the most common one, at least in my field, is with the BRCA gene. If you're found to have that gene, that mutation that puts you at risk for breast and ovarian cancer, you may decide to have prophylactic bilateral mastectomy and oophorectomy. In other words, having your breasts and ovaries removed. Now, obviously, that's a big step and a big operation. So that's a lot to think about, a lot to have to consider. Finally, there's the cost. I will say that most insurance and Medicare will cover prophylactic surgery in general based on a positive genetic test. That's not an absolute, so you can't quote me on it really, but in general, it does. But there's other concerns too. Privacy is a concern because your genetic testing results reside in the medical records of your doctor. Well, that implies that insurers could get a hold of that information and decide whether you could be insured or not. Or about employment. Maybe if the information got out that you are at risk for a certain cancer, you might not be employed by someone who knew that. So there are potentially a number of risks associated with the test that are not necessarily direct that I wanted to make sure were discussed here. Another example that may be even more alarming is the risk for colon cancer. There are certain genes that puts someone at an increased risk for colon cancer. So, if you have that gene, if you have that mutation, do you commit to having your colon removed? Do you undergo colectomy, in other words? Do you commit to having an ostomy or colostomy for the rest of your life where you have a bag that catches your intestinal contents? That's obviously a big step. So you don't want to do that without a good, firm understanding of what's going on. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is probably the most controversial, is so-called direct-to-consumer testing, or sometimes called consumer-directed testing. And they're not just exactly the same, and I'll try to explain what I mean. So direct-to-consumer testing is basically an ad that you see on the internet, on TV, wherever, that prompts an individual to approach the company and say, I want to get this test done. The company can do one of several things. They could respond by saying, you need to get your doctor to discuss it with you and let him order the test, him or her order the test. Or let me refer you to one of our own doctors that are employed by the testing company. And you could argue that an employed doctor by the testing company would have a conflict of interest there. Or they might just tell you, okay, you want to do the test, send us your specimen. Get some saliva, put it in a tube, and mail it back to us. All of that can happen. The other is so-called consumer-directed testing, where you see an ad for genetic testing, or you hear about it from a friend or a family member, whoever. Go to your physician and tell your physician, you want the genetic test, period. And the physician may or may not think you're an appropriate choice for a genetic test for all the reasons we've discussed up until now, and may try to discourage you from it. I can tell you that that has happened to me, and I've had patients who have gone elsewhere for that because they were just determined to get the test done. And I know there are physicians out there who will offer the test to patients if they want it. It's just not a good idea, and I can't recommend it. Particularly now, since there are several tests on the market out there that are the so-called multi-gene panels for testing. They claim to test lots of different genetic sites for mutations in a variety of different cancers. The problems that we haven't talked about include the fact that they're associated with limited counseling. You may not have the opportunity to talk to your doctor directly or to a genetic counselor for that matter. We already mentioned the cost, which you may not get covered if it doesn't have a doctor's approval of it in advance. And you could even argue, I think, to some degree, that the marketing methods that the testing companies are using may be unethical. In other words, if they're going directly to consumers who really don't understand what they're ordering when they order a genetic test, is that really appropriate? Not in my mind, at any rate. So the bottom line really is this. Research in genetic testing for oncology is exploding. We're trying to figure out how to specify what a specific risk is. In other words, could you take a specific mutation and predict when in a person's life the cancer might occur? Or can we find new mutations altogether for different kinds of cancers? Both of those methods of testing or methods of research are occurring as we speak. However, neither I nor most professional medical societies can endorse medical genetic testing without speaking to your doctor first. There's just too much risk of indirect harm, like we've discussed. There's the cost risk, there's the psychological risk. I think more harm will be done than good by genetic testing of inappropriate people. One example I think that's very relevant refers back to that risk of colon cancer that I discussed. So if you have a positive genetic test for colon cancer and you have to decide whether to have a colectomy and colostomy, not only is the psychological risk there of just having a colostomy, but the risk of death in association with a colectomy is significant. So you have to decide, you and your doctor have to decide, is the risk of knowing that you won't get colon cancer outweigh the risk of the procedure you'll have to do in order to accomplish that? In other words, to have the colectomy done. There's no easy answer for that sometimes. There have been and will be deaths associated with direct-to-consumer testing. So to sum it all up, please seek the guidance of your physician or a genetic counselor, if not both, before you consider genetic testing. And moving on, we'll be off healthcare for right now. We will have more subjects in the future. If you have a particular question or suggestion for a topic we might do, or a question about what we've talked about so far, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments or suggestions, and we'll certainly think about including it on a future show. On a different note, I found a new band this week. They're called Southern Avenue. They're out of Memphis, Tennessee. They've got a new album coming out on April 25th of this year titled Family. The album was recorded in Memphis at the legendary Royal Studios, which is where Al Green and Peoples, Bruno Mars, and many other legendary Memphis performers have recorded. The review of it that I found online described it as Family is a vibrant blend of Memphis soul and blues, warm sister harmonies, and positive messages reminiscent of the Staple Singers. I listened to part of the album, not all of it, but part of it, and I have to agree. If you are a fan of traditional Memphis music from the 50s, 60s, 70s, then you're going to like this band. They look like a fun-loving group of people. It's either two or three sisters and two men. They're touring regularly, and I think they're going to be stars someday. And speaking of Memphis music, I got another one for you. So I had the opportunity this week to perform at the Spotlight Bar and Grill in New Orleans, actually in the suburb, which is Metairie, Louisiana, with the Tony D'Alessandro All-Star Band. And it was a lot of fun. We did a song that many people would associate with Memphis. Several artists have done it. So we're going to let you listen to it here.
Everybody call it folk sound. You don't know folk sound. Folk sound. Folk sound. You know, now the restaurants in New Orleans call that little greens. Yes. They charge them $20. But it's in folk sound if you're looking. Now this girl I knew, she used to go down to the swamp and pick up a mess of it, bring it home, cook it up for supper. That's about all she had. Down in Louisiana, where's a girl? I swear to the world, she made the alligator look tame. Gators. Cause your mama was working on a train gang. Me, every night around supper time, go down to the truck patch, pick her a mess of pumpkin salad, carry it home in a tote bag. Everybody said it was the same. Cause your mama was working on a train gang. Oh, she did. Yeah, 30-acre pocket. Razor blade for you. Daddy was lazy and no count. Claimed he had a bad life. Now all his brothers was good for stealing watermelons out of my truck. Everybody said it was a shame, cause your mama was working on a train gang. Whoa. Listen. Wait a minute.
And that was a lot of fun. I'd like to thank, again, Tony D'Alessandro, plus the other musicians who were there, Sam Forshey, Dave Thomas, Greg de Villafranca. I really enjoyed it. If you're ever in New Orleans on a Monday night and want to have fun, the Spotlight Bar and Grill is the place to go. I think everybody can enjoy it. And I never forget about High Strangeness. I found a couple of examples this week as I was searching through the news, one of which involved a celebrity. A young woman named Kat Dennings, she's an actress who appeared in the show Two Broke Girls, was on the Jennifer Hudson talk show a week or so ago. she explained an interesting story. She said that she grew up in an extremely haunted house in Pennsylvania that dated to 1694, and that she and her family had experienced lots of unusual happenings, doors opening, closing, lights going on and off, bangs or sounds in the house that couldn't be explained, that sort of thing. And recently, her mother experienced something that they can't explain. So apparently, her mother was going to walk downstairs in their house to the basement. The staircase apparently was fairly rickety, and her mother took a couple of steps and then started to fall, like head over heels down this basement onto a concrete floor, which obviously could have been potentially very dangerous. Well, at any rate, as she started to fall, she was caught in midair by some unseen force and lifted up and placed back on the top of the stairs with minimal damage done. She had like some bruises to her hand or something, but nothing else. And Kat says her mother swears to her that this occurred. You could actually see, as Kat was on the set, goosebumps developing on her arms as she was telling this story. So there you have that. And so I heard about a new search for Nessie. That's right, the Loch Ness Monster made the news again in a couple of ways this week. There is going to be a new search done for Nessie starting in the spring of this year. It was described as being spearheaded by the Loch Ness Center Tourist Attraction and the Loch Ness Exploration, or LNE, Research Group. The effort will combine crowds of volunteers who will stand on the coast of the lake and act as spotters. It's going to include drones and other unmanned vehicles that will look above and below the water. They're going to have baited targets in the lake. This will be the third annual search of this fashion, and they're very optimistic for it, according to them. Also, Nessie was involved in another way. She's being celebrated by the UK government as part of a commemorative stamp issued by the British Royal Mint as part of a collection showcasing fabled figures from UK history. So Nessie has her own stamp now. Let's hopefully find her this time. And that's about all I had for today. The podcast has gone well, and I hope you enjoyed it. I've got some new friends of the show that I wanted to share with you. Joe Parker, who is the significant other of my friend Pat Harrison. Joe is also a friend, a Bigfoot friend. He and I actually were on the phone last night talking about some exciting Bigfoot information that he's got. Also, David Thornton. David is an old friend of mine from way back in elementary school in Memphis, Tennessee. I believe David is living now in North Carolina. We reconnected at a reunion a couple of years ago. So good to see you then, David. Hope you keep watching. Finally, Robert Toombs. He is the longtime pianist for the Reba Russell Band. Rob Toombs, who has been a good friend since our college days at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. Rob is the consummate blues musician in Memphis and a great historian of music in Memphis in general and blues music in particular. He and I have spent many discussions of blues music, the history of Memphis, the history of Beale Street, and various other things. So if you ever get a chance to see Rob, and please take the advantage of seeing him. He's lots of fun. His band is lots of fun, and he's a good guy on top of it. So, the Blues Doctor's prescription for this week includes: if you're considering genetic testing for your cancer risk, think long and hard about it. I strongly encourage you to talk to your physician and or a genetic counselor in advance. I guarantee it will be worth your while to do so. Also, check out Southern Avenue, the band's new album coming out April 25th, titled Family. I'm very enthusiastic about them. Then finally, as I say each week, please check out next week's podcast also. Okay? See you later.